Mr. Candidate, you confront a committee which has been appointed by the Council of Deans and that is charged with the task of examining both your dissertation and the propositions submitted with the dissertation. Professor Portugese Zwart will open our examination.
Dank u wel, meneer de rector. Meneer de kandidaat, welcome.
Thank you.
I read this thesis. It's the first time I read such a diverse text compared to what I normally read in PhD defenses. To scare you a little bit, I'm an astronomer. Actually, I'm a computational astrophysicist from the department of the Sterrenwacht here in Leiden. And I honestly, at first reading, half of this thesis for me is Chinese, and the other half is really in Chinese. So I'm not so sure of which part I will ask my question, so I'm afraid that my question will be slightly astronomically oriented, together with a sort of an imprint of what I read in your thesis and what I understand from that. Mm-hmm. But I hope it will be an interesting conversation anyway. And one thing that I'm, if you look at astrology and compare it with astronomy, an important thing, of course, is studying the heavens and see what is different in the heavens from today to tomorrow or from 100 years ago to now. And your thesis covers a few hundred years of history in that sense, or experience with the heavens. But there are no changes really in the heavens observed. There are no observations. There is sort of a historical background transport over the surface of this little planet, which we call Earth. And I don't see any evidence for really seeing anything, apart from sort of the mouth-to-mouth communication and other ways of communication. And so let me name a few things which are extremely important in astronomy, also in the history of astronomy. And for example, is the phases of the moon, the changes of the planets, the motion of the planets, the fact that Venus is always very near the sun, but Jupiter, for example, can be at the other side of the sun, which are all very easily observed. Shooting stars, meteorites, supernovae, this sort of phenomena, comets, all these phenomena are transient and they have a strong record in history, but apparently they don't have a record really in sort of the astrology you describe here. Can you refer to that? Why is that? And what is the difference here between the astrology part, the human communication, the way the information propagates into community, and the astronomy?
Thank you very much. Jorge Lerde opponents. To answer your question, I would point out that the astrologers in East Asia, whether they were Buddhist or Taoist, were not professional astronomers for the most part. So they actually did not have a great deal of astronomical knowledge. And we have to take into consideration that of the foreign communities in China at the time, there were Indians as well as Persian astronomers operating there. But they produced the ephemerides, the tables that give you the positions of the planets. And of course, the Chinese also had their own system of observational astronomy, as did the Indians. And so that sort of knowledge already existed at the time period that I'm talking about, which commences around the early 8th century. But as to any great innovations or changes in astronomical knowledge, I can say that the religious communities, whether Buddhist or Taoist, did not actually display any significant changes. And just as an example of that, in the year 718, there was an astronomer by the name of Gautama, who was an Indian astronomer, and he produced a manual of observational astronomy called the Navagraha Karana. However, it talks about a spherical Earth, but as far as I can tell, nobody in East Asia took that seriously. And it also gives you mathematical proofs for predicting eclipses and so on. So you did have that science, and some of the astrologers at the time would have been exposed to this at the highest levels of court, but they were never, it seems, interested or had the ability to really grasp that knowledge. So the kind of astronomical knowledge they were working with was essentially very basic. Yes.
But I would think, without any knowledge of astronomy, if you see a star today and you look tomorrow at the same spot and it's gone, then you don't need any background information on the interpretation. You can interpret that without knowing what it is, basically. So it would be sort of an ideal astrological phenomena, I would say, to make predictions for.
Well, the astrologers in East Asia, they were using established astrological lore. So for example, they would read in the text that, okay, so if Jupiter is in your birth chart in this zodiac sign, then it means this. If it's relative to this other planet in the birth chart, then it means this. So they had the established astrological lore that they had inherited from India as well as Iran.
Yeah, that's what I got also from your thesis. That
Right.
they didn't do any discoveries themselves,
No.
apart from just taking it from sort of the hierarchy they already knew was sort of correct. But they did it for many years.
They did, but I can even say that as far as China and Japan are concerned, the Buddhist astrologers were not scientists, and they weren't interested in scientific sort of discoveries and investigation of the heavens, which
Just in the interpretation for humans.
they were just interested in divination
Yeah.
and what that meant to individual lives and also to perhaps to the nation as well.
Yeah.
So, and in connection to that, they also wanted to use that knowledge, astrological knowledge, to gauge what sort of magic to practice. So there's that other component, which is astral magic. So if Saturn is determined to give you problems, then you do different rituals to placate Saturn and sort of avoid the disasters that are prognosticated.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask another small question?
Yes.
You never know the answer, but it can be very long. If I was intrigued by the pictures of the planets
Yes.
in your thesis, also because that's one of the few things I can understand, I think. But in particular, Mercury got my attention, and you have a picture of Mercury on page 90. You have a picture of Mercury on page 162, on page 187, and on page 279.
Right.
And in my perspective, this sort of shows, it's through the entire thesis, it shows sort of the evolution of the perception of Mercury in the astrological context.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at these pictures, you see the shape of Mercury slowly changing from
Yes.
a Buddha to a dragon to a standing person suddenly, and then the standing person has different things.
Mm-hmm.
Is this indeed sort of an evolutionary perception of how they saw Mercury, or is it completely random?
No, actually what you're looking at on page 90 is the Indian depiction of Mercury. And then what you see on page 162, the dragon appears to be coming through an Iranian intermediary. So I believe that's probably connected somehow with the Greco-Egyptian tradition, but I haven't been able to establish exactly where. And then the later icon that you see as Mercury as the scribe is the same icon that you see in Islamic astrological iconography, and that's none other than the Hermes, or Mercury, the scribe, messenger of the gods, and that goes back to the Greco-Egyptian tradition.
Yeah, so it really shows an evolution of
Right.
the perception of how they saw Venus.
What it shows is that there's the Indian icon, which is transmitted first, and then later you have the Iranian icons. And then what became predominant in East Asia was the Iranian icons rather than the Indian icons.
Yeah.
And that's because they were practicing astral magic, a large part of which came from the Near East, so they used the Near Eastern icons.
Thank you very much.
All right. The examination will now be continued by Professor De Weert.
Thank you. Mr. Candidate, you have produced a wonderful dissertation. It so happened that 2 weeks before I started reading the dissertation, I was traveling for Xinjiang and went to the caves in Kizil, where by a very able guide, I was also shown images of astral deities, some of which reappeared in different forms in your dissertation. His explanation was very interesting to me, but you have explained in your dissertation the connections between the images that we can still discover in Buddhist caves across Xinjiang and Central Asia and a larger Eurasian astrological system of knowledge. Not only have you done this by looking at textual evidence in different languages, I also found your analysis of the visual material reaching into the Japanese tradition as well, very compelling. So congratulations on having produced a wonderful piece of work that I think will also interest lots of people who think they have nothing to do with astrology and are not particularly interested in such an esoteric subject. As a member of the opposition committee, I also have to ask some questions and perhaps also take issue with some of the arguments that you have presented in this work. And there's two in particular that I would like to focus on. Here I'll start with the first one. You explained the rise of Buddhist astrology And also its its fall perhaps, or its disappearance as an outcome of first an emerging need and then a disappearing need for astrological knowledge. The disappearance of it is mostly related to the emergence of new Buddhist doctrinal lineages. And the appearance of it is similarly related to ritual needs, the fact that new practices require an interest in setting a calendar. What I would like you to consider as well is the competition. Can we explain the need for prognostication simply by looking at astrology, or should we also take into account other traditions for prognostication? I'm thinking of casting stocks, for example, the I Ching, that also has a long history in the Chinese case, and that certainly predates the emergence of Buddhist astrology. So my first question, did the competition have any impact in the chronology that you outline in this project?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jorge Leerde opponents. As to competition, within the Buddhist framework, we have to consider that, according to my argument, Buddhist astrology only takes off in China starting from the 8th century. There was other forms of Indian astrology transmitted through texts such as the Shardulakarna Abhidhana in earlier centuries, but the Chinese Buddhist Sangha had no need to implement this until the 8th century. It's not just divination that was compelling this interest, but what is called electional astrology, which is determining auspicious dates on the calendar based on astrological considerations. So on that point, it's actually not divination or the interest in prognostication that initially motivates the Buddhist interest in astrology. It's actually establishing the proper day for rituals. And then that also is connected with predictions and divination. But as to the competition, well, within the Buddhist context, we have to consider that in China they were very much interested in foreign knowledge and foreign techniques, especially if it could be legitimized as authentically Buddhist. So in that context, I have not really detected any evidence that would suggest that there was any substantial competition. So something like the I Ching would have been understood as native Chinese, not specifically Buddhist, and there would have been no way they could have really framed it as specifically Buddhist or necessary for Buddhist practice. Whereas within the context of Tantric Buddhism, they had to have this foreign astrological knowledge.
And as for the disappearance of it, would, for example, an emerging interest in divination amongst New Confucians, literati in the 11th, 12th century have had an impact in the disappearance of the interest?
Well, my theory is that if we look at a parallel in Japan, what we see is that esoteric Buddhism survives until the modern day, and Buddhist interest in astrology, especially within the sects of Shingon and Tendai, the esoteric traditions, continues until the modern day. And so, but in China, however, we have the decline of esoteric Buddhism after the Tang Dynasty, and maybe it still lasts into the 10th century, but it disappears. And then there's the simultaneous rise of Chan and Pure Land traditions. So in that context of Chan and Pure Land, there was no need to practice astrology or divination. And I have detected there's some evidence that Chan monks might have known a bit of astrology, but it wasn't essential to their tradition at all.
Okay. Let me follow up with a second question,
Yes,
if
sure.
time allows. Another argument that you present at various points in the dissertation is that prohibitions, legal prohibitions, prevented the popularization of astrology until after the mid-Han, so well into the 8th century. And that the reason why it did become more popular afterwards had to do with the loss of control after the An-Lushan rebellion. I would like you to assess the effectiveness of legal prohibitions at the start. What makes you think that legal prohibitions would have been effective in the early Tang? That's one issue. The second issue is that currently in Tang historical scholarship, the An-Lushan rebellion is no longer looked at as the breakdown of political control. Certainly not for large parts of the Chinese territories. There was a re-centralization in the early 9th century that was quite effective in the areas that were still under Tang control. So given that, I would like you to consider the point that you made that the effectiveness of legal control would have an impact on the popularization of astrology?
It's a very good question. To start off with, so the Buddhist context actually doesn't start from the early Tang, it starts from the mid-Tang in the early 8th century, specifically in the 720s. But at that point in time, any sort of foreign astronomical or astrological knowledge was being produced and kind of kept within the confines of the court. And I've detected no real evidence to suggest that Buddhists outside the elite levels of the court had access to this knowledge. And so I would assume that is a result of these legal prohibitions against private study of astronomy and astrology being in good effect at that point. And then when we fast forward to the 750s and 760s, we have Amoghavajra, and he produces the Shou Yao Jing, which is another one of these texts which seems to indicate an elite audience because it's telling the reader, if you need access to astronomical knowledge to determine the positions of the planets, then you should go talk to the Indian astronomers. Of course, that indicates that most of the Chinese Sangha didn't have access to that knowledge. It probably wasn't available even on the black market outside there. As to the second point of the second question you have, the second issue you're taking, I actually disagree with that because if you look at Ennin's journal, which is from the late 830s and 840s, you can very easily tell that outside of the capital region, the state often had limited authority because Buddhism was banned by Emperor Wuzong in 845, and there was the great purge of Buddhism. However, in the countryside, according to Ennin's journal, he received assistance from government officials, and there was people who were basically ignoring the court commands.
Wouldn't that hold for the earlier period as well? That the reach of the state was actually, when you look at that very local level, very limited, and perhaps even at the central level. So were there institutional mechanisms by which the court could actually implement something like a censorship measure as...
Well, basically what they were banning was books on astronomy and anything to do with astrology that could endanger the court. I assume that probably Buddhist astrology was not seen as a threat because it's about determining auspicious days for rituals. It's not court astrology, omen astrology, where you're predicting perhaps the death of the emperor or something like that. But what the Buddhists would have needed and what astrologers, popular astrologers would have needed to do horoscopy was ephemerides and almanacs to actually determine the positions of the planets, and that was considered restricted knowledge. And there also is prohibitions, which I cite in my dissertation, or not prohibitions, but I guess statements by the court demanding that court astronomers stay away from officials and unrelated, unconcerned people. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you.
Yes. The examination will now be continued by Dr. Lin.
Mr. Candidate, first I would like to say I really appreciate reading your dissertation, and I think it's a major contribution to medieval Chinese Buddhism. But I think I have to cut chase to the questions. So my question, the first question is ask you to evaluate China's agency in its appropriation or the word that you use, exception of this Indian or maybe Greco-Egyptian and Persian astrological knowledge. So throughout your dissertation, you use impact, accept more often, and influence, and sometimes transmission. So my question is that what's your theoretical stance of China's agency in its appropriation of this practice? To be more specifically, to what extent do you think this foreign knowledge, the provenance of this knowledge would matter to the Chinese or the Tang people? Another question is that I think you probably know Robert Sharp's take on esoteric Buddhism. So if the esoteric Buddhism is much more like a teaching instead of school, so how do you think this practice were, to what extent this practice were practiced in the Chinese monastic and the surrounding secular lay societies.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergei Lerde Oponen. As for the Chinese concern about the provenance of this material, that's a very interesting question. The Buddhists wanted it to be foreign. And so we have one text, the Qiao Rangzai Jue, which is attributed to this nebulous Western Indian Brahmin, who in Chinese is called Jinju Jia. However, we're not really sure what that could be reconstructed as. It doesn't appear to be a Sanskrit name. Nevertheless, it's attributed to a Western Indian. And then you have the Xiuyao Jing, which is, Amoghavajra is said to have translated it, and it has the sort of Buddhist stamp of orthodoxy by being attributed to Manjushri Bodhisattva. But within the Taoist context, however, if you look at related astrological literature that is basically drawing from foreign astrological sources, such as the Ling Tai Jing, that's attributed to a figure named Tang Mei. And then I looked this up, and Tang Mei was a court astronomer or astrologer in the 4th or 5th century Common Era. And it seems that in the Taoist literature, they were interested in concealing the foreign origins of this astrological knowledge and attributing it to some sort of past figure. And actually, the foreign origins of horoscopy in particular and nakshatra astrology were actually forgotten by the late 14th century when Song Lian, in his treatise, which I cite in the first chapter of my dissertation, is actually he's actually pointing out to people that this sort of astrology was not known in ancient China. And so he had to convince people that this was actually not originally Chinese, and therefore it's probably not appropriate for us gentlemen to be practicing it. As to your second question, the Xiuyao Jing was implemented immediately after its composition, and we know that it was practiced, or it was at least emphasized, when Kukai visited China. So he returned in the year 806 to Japan, and he is credited with, first of all, in his catalog of texts, he brings the Xiuyao Jing with him in the Hino Kuketsu, which is the oral record of Kukai produced by his disciple. Kukai actually answers some questions about the technicalities of this astrological manual, which demonstrates that he had studied this in China. And it probably goes to show that his master in China, Hui Guo, had probably taught him on the importance of this. And then we also find elements of the Xiuyao Jing incorporated into astral magical texts, going to as far as 865, as far as I have been able to tell. So in the late Tang, it was, I gather, it was an essential component to the practice of at least ritual magic in the Chinese Sangha, at least in the vicinity of Chang'an and that region.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do I have time for another
Yes,
question?
please.
This is more of my for my own curiosity. You mentioned about the Zhisheng Guangfo and 12 Tian. They were worshipped, right, in the cave temples, and also there are also Zhisheng Guangfo are also represented on silk banners. I'm just wondering what kind of worship or ritual. Basically, what's the ritual function of this worshipping?
So Zhishi Guangfo.
Yeah, and also the 12 Tian in the cave temples.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so the so-called Tejaprabha.
Yeah, Tejaprabha.
Tejaprabha. Okay, well, first of all, I'll just clarify that Tejaprabha is a reconstruction by Nanzhao Bunyu in the late 19th century. That Sanskrit name is not attested in any source.
Yeah.
So this Zhishi
Zhisheng
Guangfo
Guangfo is more authentic.
is more authentic. So the cult of Tejaprabha or Zhishi Guangfo arises in the early 9th century as a response to astrological fears. This is my theory. So within a Buddhist framework, they needed a way to defend themselves against the negative influences that were detected from the planets. And all of the planets were considered demonic, which is an Iranian concept. In any case, the ritual magic that they had within Buddhism itself was limited to deal with the planets, because they just have a set of mantras. But there was this one Tathagata, which it appears to have an Indian provenance of some sort, was introduced into China, and the texts are actually addressed against the negative influences of nakshatras, the planets, Even the zodiac signs. The zodiac signs were also deified as gods as well. So you have this sort of cosmic pantheon, and Tejaprabha, as this compassionate, benevolent Buddha, was produced or worshipped in order to counteract those forces. However, once you get to like the Dunhuang caves and once you get into like the 10th century, it appears that the original astrological function of Trishu Guangfo or Tejaprabha Buddha had actually been divorced or cut away from the cult. And in that context, he's just another Tathagata, and he's sort of like a cosmic Buddha. And because he's also depicted with all of these cosmic deities, I imagine that the perception was that this was a very powerful, cosmic, transcendental Buddha. So, in short, you have the early Tejaprabha cult, which is a response to astrology, and then you have the later Tejaprabha cult, which is basically just a worship of a specific Tathagata, which was seen as efficacious in your life.
Mm-hmm. Have you come across any kind of sources telling you if this, especially the silk banners, were used in any kind of rituals?
I haven't detected anything like that, no.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
The examination will now be continued by Professor Bisschop.
Meneer de kandidaat, I enjoyed reading your thesis very much, in which you set out a chronology of the introduction and the development of Buddhist astrology in the Tang Dynasty. Now, the thesis is mainly concerned with Chinese Buddhist sources, written in Chinese. I cannot ask you anything about Chinese, but I will, in the end, have some questions to you to explain to me the underlying Chinese of the passages I will discuss. By the nature of the subject, you also deal with sources from outside of China, in particular Indian and Iranian texts, and these, as you show, have had a great impact upon Buddhist astrology in China. Now, since some of the Chinese texts are based on Sanskrit originals that have gone lost, one of the challenges for scholars operating in your field is to reconstruct, if possible, the lost Sanskrit text. And in this connection, I would like to ask you some clarification for a passage transliterated into Chinese, but based on a Sanskrit original. And that is a passage on page 198, 199. It concerns a dharani for the ritual of Mahakala.
Right.
This dharani is a representation in Chinese characters of an original Sanskrit pronunciation, and you give the reconstruction of the dharani on page 199. Ayantu, Deva, Bhujaga, Asura, etc. You mention that this reconstruction is based on Jonen's notes in his Kyoren Show, with the added observation that this is not Orthodox Sanskrit.
Yes.
It certainly is not Orthodox Sanskrit.
Yes. I agree.
Now, you generally give, and this is very admirable, I think, for the whole thesis, you give English translations for all the sections, all the passages you quote, but you don't quote it here. Or you don't attempt an English translation for this passage, and I indeed have also great difficulties understanding it. So for a start, I would like to ask you on what basis you have reconstructed this supposedly Sanskrit original, and what sense you can make of it, if you can make sense of it.
Okay, thank you. Hoogeleerde opponent. So this dharani is found in a few texts that are preserved in the Japanese canon. And this particular dharani in Jonen's notes is preserved both in the Chinese characters, which is a Chinese transliteration from the Middle Chinese in a Japanese medium. And then he also provides the reading in Siddham script, as well as a guess at its semantic meaning. And so, based on his notes, I reconstructed the Sanskrit in this fashion. And as I point out, it's not Orthodox Sanskrit. And my feeling is that most likely this might have been composed by a Chinese monk sometime in the around the time of Kukai. And just because it's not Orthodox Sanskrit doesn't mean that it wasn't necessarily used in the Chinese Buddhist context. So we can imagine perhaps that a Chinese monk who knew a little bit of Sanskrit, he knew a lot of vocabulary, or he had a word list and the Siddham script next to him, he might have basically composed this himself. And so in that case, it's not composed by an Indian. If there was an Orthodox Sanskrit version behind this, we don't have it. And the other problem is, though, is that the Siddham script tends to be corrupted over the ages because you had scribes who were reproducing Sanskrit Dharanis without actually knowing Sanskrit. And quite often, because it's being done with an ink brush, the characters and the letters get corrupted over time. So my feeling about this is that it's probably a Chinese composition of pseudo-Sanskrit, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, that's indeed what you also explain in your note, note 245. So you assume that this was just put together on the basis of some Sanskrit words. I find it very unlikely that one would compose a dharani just like that without any attempt at creating a meaning, and it may have been done in unorthodox Sanskrit, but I would certainly expect also that we can reconstruct some meaning. So in that sense I have a proposal, and as such I would like to get your opinion based on the Chinese characters that I cannot read, and also on the just the general method of reconstructing these dharanis, because there are definitely recognizable Sanskrit words there, and if you put them together in a different way, I think it's possible at least to partly make meaning of it. First of all, that involves bringing together separate words that are printed separately into compounds, because there are clear compounds in the Sanskrit passages. And secondly, this is something I do not know, but I have the impression that sometimes in your reconstruction there are long syllables that should actually be short, and short syllables that should actually be long. For example, the first word is ayantu. I think in a dharani, ayantu would be a very likely beginning. Let them arrive, and then we get an invocation of the deities involved. So that's one question that I have, if that is a type of reconstruction that is allowed. And then my proposal is as follows. So then first of all we have a compound Deva Bhuja Gasura Kinnarindra Shakradaya rather than Shakradaya. Again there we have, so this is my question, we have I have to switch the long syllable and the short syllable, but then we basically get let them arrive, the Devas, the snakes, the Asuras, the Kinnaras. Well, then we have Indra Chakra, it's not so clear what to do with that, and we end with Adya, so all those deities starting with, and then we have categories of gods. Then we have in your reconstruction Buddham Vacha. I would prefer to read Buddha Vacha. I also wonder if there is an Anusvara represented in the Chinese. So basically we have the word of the Buddha. Then we have a compound, I think a clear compound, Prashama Saukya Nimitta Bhutam, the word of the Buddha being the cause, the nimitta of calmness and of pleasure. Then we have a passage that I can also not make sense of. And finally we have that here, Tat Iha. Perhaps Shravaniya Dharma is the Dharma that should be listened to. And so we are not there yet, but I think there's clearly an underlying meaningful Sanskrit sentence. But my main question is to what extent you think some of these reconstructions can be, the reconstruction that I proposed is a valid way of doing it, or am I entering into territory that is not, that is simply not allowed by the constitution of the Chinese characters and the method that should underlie the reconstruction of these texts?
Well, thank you very much. And not being a Sanskritist myself, I didn't attempt to do any sort of authoritative reconstruction of this. And I think if you deviate too far away from the Siddham version of the Sanskrit as it's preserved in this Japanese text, then you're perhaps reading too much into it. You're attempting to find an orthodox, legitimate Sanskrit verse that might not have actually existed originally. As to the actual Chinese characters, they're used phonetically, not semantically, and being that when they wrote out the Dharanis, when they wrote up Sanskrit words in Chinese characters, it was done very approximately, it was done very sloppily, and it wasn't done in any sort of standardized fashion. And to complicate matters more, this Dharani actually has different versions of Chinese characters. There's some characters which are varied throughout the different texts that I surveyed. But the basis of my reconstruction was Jonin's notes in Siddham script, and so something like Buddham Vacha. It should be Buddha Vacha, but it didn't say that. It said Buddham Vacha. So given this context, I get this suspicion that the original Dharani was probably composed by a Chinese author who probably was just using word lists and jumbling it together. But if we were to try to attempt a really sort of accurate, strong reconstruction of an Orthodox Sanskrit, I think, as you pointed out, you could attempt that, but we might be reading too much into it at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The examination will now be continued by Dr. Van der Veer.
Geachte kandidaat, first want to congratulate you on a good piece of work. I enjoyed reading it. Lots of things I was interested in the text. However, some questions I want to pose to you again, I would say. First one is a simple one. Did you find out before the ceremony whether this is an appropriate moment and an auspicious moment for you? This thesis.
Zeker leerde opponents. Actually, I did look at the present astrological circumstances of this moment, and Mars and Mercury are conjunct at the almost exact same position that I was born. When I was born, Mars and Mercury were conjunct in Leo, and at the moment they are also conjunct in Leo. So it's very auspicious because Mars and Mercury conjunct actually signifies strong scholarship and aggressive debate abilities. So yes, it is quite auspicious at this moment.
Well, thank you very much for your elaborate answer, because it illustrates the way you work with astronomy, just comparing to a simple Buddhist monk who just takes his diary and tries to see if it's Butsumetsu or
Right.
Tomiki or whatever. And that's exactly, I think, one difference which you also see, I have a question about this in societies. Now, I think I know somewhat more about Japan than China, but the actual elite context in which astrological and astronomical thinking is done, and the everyday life of the people, I think there is a big difference that we can see in some texts where people just advise, well, we'll not go into detail, but because today it's a nice day for a fire ritual, pustika or whatever, that the actual economic value of rituals is maybe propped up by the astro-magical, I'm borrowing your words, I think they're quite appropriate at all times, is a matter of concern, and not the whole universe and its influences. And my first question on this matter would be, the discussion was going about influences, and sometimes I heard negative influences. And you also talk sometimes about negative influence. How can you explain negative influences in Shingon theoretical concept in which influences are there, but are not to be qualified as either positive, negative, etc. Because where you are the influences from the planets, the stars, sun, etc. always negative?
Okay, so to clarify your question, I mean to answer your question, I just have to point out that Shingon itself uses the Tsukuyokyo, which is a very basic manual, all things considered, for determining an auspicious day. You just have to know the day of the month it is according to the Chinese calendar, and then you look at the corresponding nakshatra, the Indian nakshatra for that day.
Yep.
And so it's a relatively simple process. However, if you go to the Heian and Kamakura periods, Shingon monks were not actually practicing horoscopy, which is this advanced art of actually determining the positions of the planets, either in the past or the present, sometimes also looking at the future. And that was the domain of the Tsukuyoshi, the Tsukuyodo, which I explained in the dissertation in the final chapter. And so you would have had these professional astrologer monks who analyzed the heavens. And so, for example, in the horoscope from the year 1113, called the Tenne horoscope, this horoscope was produced for a monk at Koyasan, and I know that's based on the inscription because it was reproduced a few years after its composition at Koyasan. And the horoscope, instead of talking about sons, it talks about disciples, and instead of talking about possession of properties, it talks about possessions of temples. So we know this was produced for a Shingon monk. At the same time, when the astrologer detects that something might be negative, he informs the client that you should do pujas, you should do rituals for these planets. So for example, in his horoscope, Rahu is considered in a very poor position, and it's also connected with Saturn, which is very negative. And so what he points out in some cases, he says, so Rahu will be going to this point in your horoscope. Therefore, you should do rituals to placate the planets in this way. So that's negative. But in some cases, because they're basing their astrological interpretation on a manual of Hellenistic astrology, the Duli Usajing in Chinese, Dorotheus. This is a translation of Dorotheus, which is authentic Hellenistic astrology. You also have positive influences that are detected as well. So for example, if Jupiter, which is a very beneficial planet, is in a certain place in the chart, he comments that this is going to be very auspicious, very fortunate. And so in that case, you would not necessarily have to conduct a ritual against Saturn, or against Jupiter, because Jupiter is a beneficial planet. But within the context of Shingon, it appears that Shingon monks themselves were not practicing more advanced horoscopy. They were practicing the more basic forms of electional astrology, which is determining auspicious times for rituals. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that's a big question. There's still some time.
Yes, please.
Because the other part of my question was about the environment of the ritual needs of population and state and emperor to make it
Right.
easier. Do you think that in general influences in everyday life for the populace would have been determined by Tsukioshi, by the Tsukio, or whether also is it, let's say, a complex system of all kinds of influence, not only astrological method, but also, for instance, independent with I Ching, divination, curative rituals, etc.
The evidence suggests that in Japan, the common population didn't have access to the Tsukuyoshi. So that sort of astrology was basically meant for elite Buddhist monks and nobility. You had some Tsukuyoshi who were operating at the imperial court. They were also practicing astromagic for Kamakura and Heian period aristocrats. So common people didn't have access to that level of astrology. As for the Tsukuyokyo, I imagine a lot of common monks, especially those who were literate, would have had access to the Tsukuyokyo, not just Shingai, but also Tendai. And I've noticed that once you get to the Edo period, and I've looked at the National Library in the National Diet Library in Tokyo, and there's actually a fair amount of basic, woodblock prints. So they were mass-produced manuals, explanations of the Tsukuyokyo. And so probably once you get to the Edo period and the proliferation of literacy and education, more people had access to that. If you step outside of Japan and you look at Dunhuang documents, the sort of astrology that common people had access to in a daily life without being able to consult an astrologer, what they practiced was the 7-day week. And the 7-day week is originally a Greco-Egyptian religious calendar, which is a combination of Greek and Egyptian ideas, which I explained in the dissertation. But that was transmitted also to East Asia, and it was very easily accessible kind of astrology. So you would know that, well, today is Sunday, so it's auspicious to do religious rituals. It's auspicious to make offerings to monks. But today might be Saturday, so Saturday is not auspicious for certain things. And then they would also make predictions about your future based on the day of the week you were born. So in some cases, if you're born under Sunday, you're supposed to have a very good personality. If you're born under Mars, Tuesday, then you might be considered, you might have some sort of aggression or martial capability, something like that. And so at the common level, I suspect in China and maybe also in Japan, they would have had access to some sort of basic materials like that. But the other thing to consider that astrology required literacy. And so most of the illiterate population wouldn't have had access to this unless they talked to some sort of professional diviner or priest or something. But for most people, it wasn't necessary, I think. Or they didn't have access to it. But that being said, in Dunhuang, we do have that one famous horoscope from the late 9th century, which was produced probably by a Sogdian, and we have those running interpretations. So you did have professional astrologers, even in a remote location such as Dunhuang.
Kind of almanacs were around as well.
And they had the almanacs, but again, that's very accessible because you just have to know the day of the week, and then you can start making predictions based on that. You don't actually have to do the calculations necessary to build a horoscope. Because you need the Ephemerides, but you also have to have a certain amount of mathematical knowledge and know how to use the counting rods Because in order to calculate the position of Mars 16 years ago in July 31st, something like that, you have to know the math behind it. And so you had to have access to all this knowledge and books and so on, and common people didn't have access to that.
So it was more of an assumed system than a real planetary system.
Right. And you needed professionals, basically. It was a profession, and you would have had to study for this for at least a couple of years, I imagine. So, and have access to the texts. And in the Japanese context, the Tsukuyodo seems that, like a lot of Japanese lineages, they wanted to keep their texts to themselves. They didn't want to share them around, which is why some of the key texts of the Tsukuyodo, like the Duli Yusujing, it doesn't appear that that text has survived until modern times, because I suspect that the lineage didn't want it to be copied and circulated around. But
so it maybe exists in an oral transmission.
Well, no, I don't think it would have, because it's like Kambun, right? So that's a long Chinese text. It was 5 like maki, right? So that would have been a really long text. If somebody had memorized that, I would have been surprised. But it's also, if we look at the horoscope, he's quoting the text, like he'll say like, Iwaru, right? Iwaru, and then he quotes the text in Chinese. And so then he would have been looking at the text itself. So.
Mr. Candidate, the time allotted to the examination of your dissertation and its propositions has passed. The committee withdraws in order to deliberate. I request that you and your company await our return here.